This is my favorite home console version of NBA Hangtime. The N64 version of this game is simply fantastic. The graphics are excellent and the game is fast. Honestly, I prefer this version to the arcade version. When most people talk about NBA Hangtime, they're thinking about the N64 release. So unlike the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of the game, the N64 version was actually a really big seller, and it was really popular, especially back in 1997. And the other thing is that this was one of the first N64 games to be released at all, though you've probably forgotten that part. Back in summer 1996, the hype for Nintendo's upcoming 64-bit system was huge. Now, the true old guys will remember when the N64 was called the Ultra 64, such as in this Nintendo Power preview way back in June 1995. Though this short preview didn't actually give us any information, it really did get the hype train rolling. And so, in those early magazines, you would see constant references to what they started calling the NU64. At some point in time, the name was quietly changed to the N64, though the hype continued. There was also a ton of hype around the N64 disk drive, which was a heavily delayed add-on that never came out in North America and wound up being a major failure in Japan. So I think that Nintendo learned the hard way back in the mid-1990s that you've got to be careful when you hype up the latest and greatest video game systems and technology. So the N64 got all of the hype, and a lot of the hype was justified. It's not a bad system. But the N64 disk drive wound up being a hilarious example of Nintendo's ridiculous hype. And the small N64 library in the end reflected just how hard it was to make games for the system. Anyway, by the time these screenshots finally came out, readers of Nintendo Power had been getting hyped about the N64 for well over a year. And it's not like the hype was totally misplaced. I mean, Mario 64 was legitimately an awesome game. But what people tend to forget is that there were only 8 N64 games for sale in Christmas 1996. A lot of the cool-looking games Nintendo Power was hyping up back in June 1996 had not come out yet, such as Blast Corps, which didn't come out in Japan even until March 1997. And Body Harvest was delayed by Nintendo because of its violent themes. It didn't receive an official release until October 1998. This is honestly the untold story of the N64. Most people remember the games that were hits, Mario 64, Star Fox 64, Killer Instinct Gold, GoldenEye, and so on. But there were a lot of promised titles that never emerged, and the games that did come out were delayed beyond belief. But of course, the kids didn't realize all the issues the system had. A lot of kids wrote letters to Santa Claus asking for the system, as you can see in these letters from a Lancaster, Kentucky newspaper. The thing is, though, that $200 for a system was a hard sell when there weren't even a dozen games available and every game cost over $60. Even the most positive newspaper reviews, the ones that were actually advertisements, couldn't help but notice that the price of cartridges was a lot steeper than the price of PlayStation games. A brand new PlayStation cost the same $200, but the games were cheaper and there was a much bigger selection of games. Plus, as you already know, the PlayStation games were capable of holding a lot more data. Now, back in those days, I was a big Nintendo fan, and in my defense, back then I was only like 12 years old. I thought that cartridge-based systems were awesome, especially since there were no loading times. After all, I read about it in Nintendo Power. In hindsight, however, the PlayStation was clearly the superior system. There was an article in this North Adams, Massachusetts newspaper by a columnist who admitted that she begrudgingly gave in and got an N64 for her family for Christmas that year. She noted that famous N64 preview videotape that went to Nintendo Power subscribers. This was the ultimate hype tool that was sure to convince the Nintendo kids. Well, I would show you a copy of that same VHS, but I honestly don't know which one she's referring to. Nintendo Power sent out a whole bunch of tapes like that back in the early days of the N64. In fact, I'm pretty sure I had one when I was growing up. You can find a lot of them if you do just a simple search on YouTube. Anyway, the columnist noted that you needed to shell out $50 or more for a game after your initial $200 purchase. And then there was the problem of finding a second controller for two-player fun, since the system came with only one controller, despite the fact that it had slots for 4. In theory, an extra controller should have cost only about $30. In reality, scalpers were asking for high prices for everything, and even higher prices for additional controllers. And Nintendo did what it could to hold back the system to drive up demand until the very last moment. Well, you and I know all about Nintendo doing something similar these days, but this was new territory back in 1996. The Super Nintendo was abundantly available when it was first released, and it actually came with, believe it or not, 2 controllers out of the box. The NES was the same way, and people were going to great lengths to get a system that only had a couple of games at launch, which really is incredible. Anyway, NBA Hangtime came out on the N64 a few weeks after Christmas in early January 1997. When it was released, the N64 was far and away the superior version of Hangtime. The graphics were an obvious step up over the other console versions. Now, the Genesis version isn't awful, of course, but it's obvious that the N64 version was in another league. And the less I say about the Super Nintendo version, the better. Now, it's true that the arcade version still had superior graphics and sound.
He shoots! Book it! Hammer it! Blaze it up! He's lighting it up!
But the N64 version is honestly really close. It's closer than you would expect. Even though it was still just a 2D game, NBA Hangtime still showed off the capabilities of the N64 right from the start. And this was the perfect game to serve as the first basketball game on the console. Actually, when you play this game, you'll notice that it seems a little bit faster than the arcade version. It's also got all of the features that the arcade version has. At least I haven't noticed anything that's obviously missing. The code system works the same as in the arcade version, though I still had a little bit of trouble getting certain codes to register. And you've also got guest characters, though they're not quite as impressive as the ones on the acclaimed home ports of NBA Jam. Now, there's really only one complaint that I have about the N64 version of Hangtime. The default controls are totally bizarre, and I really don't know how they managed to screw this up. If you look at an old Hangtime arcade machine, you will notice that it uses 3 buttons, just like NBA Jam. Of course, the 3-button setup made it ideal for consoles with 3 buttons, which is one of the reasons the Genesis version is so much fun to play. The N64 controller, however, had a ton of buttons, 6 on the front plus the bumper buttons. By default, the N64 version ignores the top row of buttons and uses A as the turbo button plus down C as shoot and right C as pass. In order to play the game with my control pad, I had to go in ahead of time and completely change that controller system. So unfortunately, I don't have an N64 style controller to show you, but I really don't understand how they expected kids to be able to hold down the A button for turbo while pushing the C buttons that were right next to it. I mean, it's not a huge problem, you can go in and you can change the control scheme, but it's just a really strange way to set up your controller. But once you've got the control set up right, the game really is a lot of fun. In my opinion, this is probably the best console version of NBA Hangtime out there. Nintendo Power did its part to hype the game up, giving it an 8-page spread in the January 1997 issue. And this included previews of every single team, making this one of the most detailed reviews of the game around. In the end, the magazine gave this game high ratings. However, it did note at the bottom that the default control button selection is really awkward, which means that I'm not the only one who struggled with it. Though the review wasn't as long as Nintendo Power's, GamePro also gave Hangtime a stellar review, and the ratings tell you all you need to know about how good this port is. Electronic Gaming Monthly was less impressed, complaining that the game was a little bit too difficult. But then again, EGM gave NBA Jam Extreme on the PlayStation a silver medal, which is absolutely ridiculous. Well, that's just proof that those two reviewers didn't know what they were talking about. Anyway, I strongly recommend pulling out Hang Time for the N64, especially if it's been a while for you. It's a solid port and it's a whole ton of fun to play.